Have you ever begun planning an event and just thought, I have no idea how to budget for this? There's so many people coming and I don't want to go over budget. I don't want to lose money on it, but I don't even really know where to start in choosing meals and choosing locations, in knowing what our break-even point is. So this is a spreadsheet tool that can help you figure out where to start and at least give you a baseline of a break-even point for your organization and its events. I've developed this so that it works really well for our organization, but you can edit it so that it works well for whatever types of events you're putting on. Because we're a professional organization, we often host events with a member price and non-member price. In your facility, that might be an employee price and a non-employee price, or maybe your employees go for free. Or maybe departments pay for it at a discounted rate. So figure out what works best for you. In our particular case, and I'll walk you through a sample case, we are going to be hosting an event, and our member registration is going to be $200, and our non-member is going to be $300. And this is a multi-day event with upwards of 12 contact hours. So we generally charge about this much for that much continuing education. So based on last year's numbers, as we move into this event, we'll go with 84 members and 41 non-members. So you can see that I can key in all of my information here. I can edit those prices as well. If only $100 ends up being the member registration, you can see our total amount to cover costs goes down. Again, in this case, it's 200, thank goodness. We also want to enter the number of staff members or non-registrants, because that's going to come into play when we start planning meals, which is probably the most expensive aspect of any event that you're planning if you offer meals. If you don't offer meals, then it's not a big deal, but that's probably the most complex part that we have to deal with. In our case, we have about 10 staff members that are generally at events, or speakers that are getting their meals paid for, or whatever the cost may, or whatever the case may be. We also have fixed costs. So we have the meeting room costs. For this event, we normally have to pull out about 2 to 3 rooms between eating and exhibitor space and breakout sessions. And we'll say that that costs about $900. And what's interesting is after you start tracking these for a few years, you'll start to notice trends. So I can tell that since 2016, for instance, the cost of these rooms has gone up around $50 to $100 a year, every year. So that helps me continue to plan as we move forward for those break-even points. We usually need 1 or 2 extra handheld microphones in a room. That's generally about $40, maybe a lapel mic. We tend to have a projector in each room, so that's $400. Depending on where we go, sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes an extra presentation screen. I never pay for an extension cord because we can bring them. And staging setup. That's often if you're doing like award ceremonies or any kind of business meetings, sometimes you'll want a nicer setup, and that's why that's kind of a standing item on ours, because we tend to have lots of events with staging setup. But you can fit that to whatever the case may be for your organization. Sometimes people are doing it in hospitals, or you might have to pay for like a license to use some of a specific technology, like audience response system, something like that. You might pay per event for those. So just thinking about that kind of stuff. And you can add as many fixed costs as you'd like. So these fixed costs are going to stay the same regardless of how many people are there. We're going to have to pay these costs. So once we kind of knock those down and figure out our budget, what I've done is essentially figured out that our trend is about 60% of budget for events goes towards meals. So you can see here, $129, that would be $129 per person. And this is set up to be a formula that takes the total amount budgeted, which is that 60% number, and compares it to the total number of attendees and adds all of these together. So as you can see, the very top, it tells you enter numbers only in shaded areas. You can put a 0 in the cell if it's not applicable. So I did this so that anybody on our staff could hop in and work on it, and that was my attempt to make it user-friendly for people who aren't as familiar with Excel. So again, figure out what works for your team. I just wanted it to be usable beyond just the person who designed it. So as I move forward, I pull 60% as my starting point for meals. This event, although it has a ton of contact hours, is actually a pretty tight event. It's only a day and a half, very full day and a half, but it's a pretty short event, so it actually cuts back a lot of our costs in that regard. Because it's such a long day, we do end up paying for breakfast and snacks that first day so that the nurses don't get too crabby with us. So what I end up doing here is, personally, this works for me, and you, again, can edit it however you want, but I take it and put in a percentage here that goes off the budgeted amount for the meals. So the reason I do that and the reason it works for me is because I can look at something and I can look at, say, a full 2-day event and know that 50% of my meal budget is going to go on day 1 and 50% of my meal budget is going to go on day 2, and probably about 30% of that 50% might go to the lunch or dinner, just because those are bigger meals over like the snacks or breakfast. So it just kind of helps me break it out into chunks. You know, you go with whatever works for you. I also would point out, I do keep beverages separate just because those tend to be charged at kind of a bizarre rate a lot of times. If you leave coffee and tea out all day, nurses are going to drink it. So we end up paying a lot in beverages, and I didn't want to break that into breakfast or snacks or lunch designation just because it's so variable. And we end up paying about the same for beverages regardless. So let's just start doing it, I guess. So again, like I said, I've got a day and a half for this event, and I normally start with about 30% of the total meal budget being for a lunch. This gives me a ton of money to play with per person. $38 is a lot of money. So I know I'm going to come down from that based on how much money we're making on this event, because we have a lot of non-member registration, or a lot of member registrations that we're going in, a lot of non-member registrations that we're getting. So I key in 30, I see that that allows me for $38 per person for lunch, and I think that's a lot. So now I can kind of bump it down to 20. So then I can look at, okay, I can spend about maybe 10% of my meal budget on breakfast the next day, and maybe 20% on day 2 lunch. So this is giving me a pretty good amount to work on. And I always like to remind everybody, don't forget, you can come in under budget. It's okay. You don't have to come in right at budget every time. So if I end up at, let's see, maybe snacks are going to be around $12 a person as well. So we'll plan for 10% for those. And we don't offer dinner at this particular event. Some of our events we do, and it costs a lot, but we don't offer it at every event. So these percentages, this is slightly confusing, and This is where I just encourage you to go with whatever works for you. These numbers are the percentage of the 60%, the bolded at the top. But then here at the bottom, I calculate the actual amount that will cost me and the total amount of the total budget. So right now you can see we're 12% lower than we thought we would be. I haven't added those those drinks yet, but they generally come in around 10%. That's our trend, but 10% is a ton for this one. So I'll drop it down. I would say for this many people, about 100 people, it'll probably cost us around $600. It's going to be my guess. So I think the best thing to remember is just sort of use everything interchangeably. When I key in a percentage, it just sort of helps me whittle down closer to a dollar amount. It's also, you can also set up so it goes off dollar amounts as well. However works for you. This is kind of helpful for us because it sort of gives us a budget to work within when we're picking those meals. So I know that I can pick a pretty hearty lunch on the menu for $25 and still be pretty reasonably comfortable in our budget. But then as we start playing with some other variable costs, this may change. So I'm going to say that drinks are going to be about 5%. That's fair. And then the nice part about this is that this will automatically calculate your gratuity as well. The way that this gratuity line is set up is that it adds everything together and then multiplies it by the percentage you key in. Most places do 18%. That's the case for this location. So now you can see it turns red because I'm over budget slightly, but I am over that 60% line, and I don't want to be if I can help it. And like I said, $25 is a ton to spend on supper, and close to 13 is a lot to spend on breakfast too. So maybe I'll drop because it's a half day and I don't have to keep them as long, maybe I'll drop the second day down to 8% and the lunch down to 16% and that gives me $20 still to play with, and I'm coming in pretty good under budget. So I'm at 55% of my total budget in meals. I need to pay 8 speakers, and we give an honoraria. Let's say we're going to give them $150 each for what they're doing. So that's $1,200. So you can see my variable costs are coming in right at 60%. So at the rate that I'm going with just these costs, and there's always extra costs, right? So I always try to keep a handful, maybe $1,500 in the bank for something this big, just for variable costs. Maybe we pay for centerpieces for the table. Maybe we're paying for a raffle gift. Maybe we are donating to our foundation on behalf of somebody. There could be a number of different reasons to keep money on hand. So I just like to keep a little bit aside just in case. So now I can look at it and I can make 25% profit and still be under budget. So this is kind of the gist of how this particular spreadsheet works. And I hope that it proves useful. If you have any questions about any of the formulas, just let me know.